The Most Unknown, the Rothko Chapel's Image of the Divine. I am grateful to the Rothko Chapel for assistance with this project. All images were provided by the Rothko Chapel and are used with kind permission. The image of the divine as unknown and unknowable has ancient roots in many religious and philosophical traditions. In this presentation, I examine the ways in which the Rothko Chapel, an interfaith sanctuary housing murals by Mark Rothko, illustrates the unknown divine through its lack of explicit religious imagery. The chapel is located in Houston, Texas, and was commissioned by Jean and Daniélou in 1964. Opened to the public in 1971, it is a small, dimly lit, monochromatic space that contains 14 Rothko murals and serves as a center for humanitarian advocacy as well as spiritual reflection. As a space that houses paintings by one of the most famous artists of the 20th century, the chapel may also be perceived as a museum. However, in this presentation, I speak of the chapel as a spiritual center. My goal is to examine the chapel as a whole work of art, indeed as a whole image, rather than as a repository for well-known paintings. It should be noted that it is the policy of the chapel to not release images of the paintings alone, only in situ. The chapel is characterized by meaningful paradoxes. It is soothing yet stimulating, subdued yet expressive, restricted yet liberating. The lack of directionality leads the viewer, or perhaps more properly, the participant, into all directions. Daniélou attributed the expressive power of the chapel to its refusal to define the divine. In her words, God is the one without a name with an infinity of names. The eloquence we have lost by explaining and defining too much may have been regained by artists. This view is similar to one expressed by Tony Kelly, which I will touch upon later in this presentation. The interior of the chapel is dark and monochromatic, illumined by a skylight. Please note that in person, the chapel appears darker than is indicated by photography. One of Rothko's chief concerns regarding the chapel was that the light would be too strong. The darkness of the chapel is in itself expressive of the divine, as I will later discuss in the context of Jean Danielou's writings. The chapel's octagonal shape reinforces a sense of directionlessness and, by extension, a sense of openness and universality. Without physical orientation, one can achieve spiritual orientation as the paintings draw the eye beyond and within. The concept of the divine as unknown has roots in many traditions. Whether one considers apophatic or negative theology, Neoplatonism, the theologians of the Middle Ages who espoused, in Kenny's words, the doctrine of divine ineffability, or agnostic modes of thought, the divine is presented as unknowable. The image of God as one who is beyond description or illumination is present in such disparate traditions as the mysticism of the Kabbalah and Catholicism. As an example of the former, I turn to Franke's work on Jewish poet Edmond Jabès. According to Franke, Jabès's poetry expresses Jewish mysticism by presenting images for the unrepresentable. Franke comments that all words and images are metaphors for the nameless, for nothing. Yet, as metaphors, they do not furnish a handle for this ultimate nothing, but rather express the rupture of all expression with the unthinkable. Such ideas resemble those offered by Cardinal Jean Daniélou, who asked, "Is it even necessary to speak of God? God is the most known and the most unknown. In God and the Ways of Knowing, Daniélou discussed Catholicism as well as the other religious traditions of history and region, and asserted that God is both transcendent and personal. Daniélou associated the divine with darkness, a darkness that is inaccessible. I now turn to the recent work of Tony Kelly, in which chapels are presented as both symbols of faith and works of art. Kelly notes that a case might be made that all genuine art is religious in some sense, and further observes that in modern times there is a concern that religious work not be idolic, that is, simply reflecting back in clearly recognizable form the faith and devotion of the religious mind. It should be rather iconic, that is, backlit, we might say, by the indefinably transcendent. Kelly's words seem particularly well suited to describe the Rothko Chapel. Rather than offering an idolic image of the divine, the chapel expresses that which is fundamentally inexpressible through an iconic or aniconic representation. The chapel's paradoxes reveal a divine image, an unknown that becomes known, through the power of blankness to depict, the power of smallness to enlarge, the power of universality to focus, and the power of silence to speak. The chapel also illustrates Danielou's perception of the divine shrouded by darkness. The chapel's skylight is covered with a diffusing scrim and baffle to further obscure the space, and the near-black tones of the interior paradoxically convey a divine darkness that is anything but nihilistic. The Rothko Chapel presents an image of the divine that illuminates with darkness and illustrates with aniconism. The chapel's lack of religious imagery paradoxically reinforces the divine, an unknown divine, a transcendent spirituality, in Franke's words, a mystique of the nothing, however, that contains everything.